I never imagined a Christmas dinner would change the course of my entire marriage. But that's exactly what happened when my mother-in-law called me a gold digger in front of everyone. My relationship with James had been a careful balancing act. For years. Him caught between his wealthy family's expectations and his love for me, the nobody from the wrong side of town. But as I stood there in their magnificent dining room, crystal glasses trembling as his mother hurled accusations about my intentions, none of them realized one critical detail. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was standing in my own house. The journey to that moment began, long before I met James. I was raised to believe that success comes from hard work and smart choices, not from family connections or inherited wealth. My parents owned a small hardware store in a blue-collar neighborhood, honest people who taught me the value of every dollar earned. They couldn't afford to send me to college, so I worked 3 jobs to put myself through business school, graduating with honors and thousands in student loans that I was determined to pay off myself. By 26, I'd built a reputation as someone who could turn failing businesses around. I specialized in identifying undervalued properties and transforming them into profitable ventures. I lived modestly, drove a second-hand car, and poured every extra cent into investments. While my friends splurged on designer clothes and luxury, vacations, I was buying my first commercial building, a rundown warehouse I converted into trendy office spaces. Then came more properties, strategic flips, and eventually, the acquisition of a historic estate that had fallen into disrepair, Oakridge Manor. The sprawling mansion nestled on 15 acres had been a labor of love for me, a restoration project I'd undertaken with the best craftsmen in the region, reviving its 19th century glory while keeping my ownership private through a corporate entity. I'd planned to turn it into a boutique hotel, but something about its grand library and secret garden made me reluctant to share it with the world. So it remained mine alone, my one extravagance in a life otherwise defined by practical investments and careful planning. Then I met James at a charity fundraiser where I was representing one of my commercial clients. He was charming, intelligent, and refreshingly down-to-earth despite his family's old money status. He asked thoughtful questions about my work without the condescension I'd often encountered from people in his social circle. When he suggested coffee the following week, I surprised myself by saying yes. Our relationship progressed naturally. Weekend hikes, quiet dinners, long conversations about books and dreams. James worked as an environmental lawyer, often taking on cases pro bono for communities fighting against corporate polluters. His passion for justice was genuine, his privilege tempered by a sincere desire to make a difference. I fell in love with his mind first, then his heart, and eventually told myself it didn't matter that he came from a world so different from mine. 6 months in, James took me to dinner at an elegant restaurant overlooking the city skyline. "I should warn you," he said, twirling pasta around his fork. "My family can be a bit intense." "All families have their quirks," I replied, having no idea what awaited me. James laughed, but his eyes remained serious. "The Hawthornes take intense, to Olympic levels. Old money, old values, old judgments. My father expects me to take over the family investment firm eventually, marry someone from our social circle, and maintain the dynasty." "And what do you want?" I asked, reaching for his hand. "I want you," he said simply. "The rest will figure out as we go." The first meeting with his parents was at their summer home, a sprawling oceanfront property where the staff outnumbered the family members. Elizabeth Hawthorne, James's mother, assessed me like a gemologist examining a suspected fake. Her questions were precise, designed to uncover my background, education, and connections, or lack thereof. William Hawthorne, behind his practiced smile, seemed to be calculating exactly how much of a liability I might be to their carefully curated family image. "And what exactly do you do, Olivia?" Elizabeth asked, her voice like silk over steel. "I work in business development and property management," I answered, deliberately vague. Years of negotiations had taught me that sometimes revealing too little was more effective than revealing too much. "How practical," she replied, in a tone that made practical sound like a terminal disease. Later, as James drove us back to the city, I could feel his tension. "They'll warm up to you," he said, though we both knew he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "I'm not sure they've warmed up to anyone in their lives," I replied, making him laugh and breaking the heavy silence. Despite the rocky start, James and I grew closer. He proposed a year later, not with a flashy diamond that would impress his family, but with his grandmother's simple sapphire ring that had been left specifically to the woman who captures my grandson's heart for who he is, not for his name. We married in a small ceremony by the lake, his family attending with tight smiles and rigid posture, my family bringing homemade food and genuine warmth. We settled into a comfortable apartment in the city, and I continued managing my investments while James built his legal career. His parents invited us to obligatory family events, always held at one of their numerous properties, always orchestrated to remind me of my outsider status. I endured their subtle jabs and not-so-subtle questions about when I might consider a more suitable career for someone married to a Hawthorne. "Perhaps something in charity work," Elizabeth suggested during one particularly painful Sunday brunch. "Many of the wives serve on boards. It would give you purpose." I smiled politely while mentally reviewing the commercial lease agreement. I was negotiating for a waterfront development worth 8 figures. "I'll certainly consider it," I replied, which wasn't technically a lie. James did his best to shield me from his family's worst behaviors, but their disapproval was a constant undercurrent in our lives. I never told him how his sister cornered me at their father's birthday party to ask if I'd signed a prenuptial agreement, or how his cousin accidentally spilled red wine on my dress after discovering I'd gone to state college on scholarship, and I never ever revealed the truth about my financial situation. Not because I was hiding anything, but because it simply never seemed relevant. James and I split our expenses fairly, lived within our means, and rarely discussed money beyond practical household matters. He knew I was successful in my work, but had no idea of the extent of my investments or assets. I'd been financially independent for so long that it never occurred to me to announce my net worth, even to my husband. Then came the Christmas that changed everything. 3 years into our marriage, James and I had found our rhythm. We'd decorated our apartment with a mix of vintage finds and modern pieces, creating a space that felt entirely our own. Weekday mornings were a choreographed dance of coffee mugs and hurried kisses as he headed to his law firm and I to my office, a converted industrial space where I managed my growing portfolio with a small, fiercely loyal team. Weekends were ours alone. Sometimes we'd drive to the coast, walk barefoot on the sand, and eat at little seafood shacks where no one knew the Hawthorne name. Other times we'd stay home, reading in comfortable silence or hosting dinner parties for our eclectic mix of friends, artists, teachers, community activists, and entrepreneurs who valued ideas over inheritances. "You've changed him," James's sister Charlotte remarked during a family dinner, her tone making it unclear whether this was an accusation or an observation. "He's just being himself," I replied, watching James across the room as he laughed with his younger cousin, the family's other black sheep. Charlotte twirled her wine glass, studying me. The James I grew up with wore tailored suits to breakfast and knew which fork to use for each course without thinking. The James who married you wears jeans with holes and brings homemade casseroles to family gatherings, I smiled. And which James seems happier to you? She didn't answer, but her expression softened slightly. It was the closest thing to approval I'd received from any of the Hawthornes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As our third anniversary approached, James and I began discussing the future more seriously. We both wanted children, but the timing never seemed right. His career was demanding, with important cases requiring late nights and weekend work. My business was expanding, with new opportunities emerging faster than I could evaluate them. "Maybe next year," became our refrain, a promise we made to ourselves and each other without fully committing to it. The truth was, I was hesitant to bring children into the complicated dynamics of the Hawthorne family. Elizabeth had already made it clear that any grandchildren would be enrolled in the right schools, introduced to the right families, and groomed for the right futures, regardless of what their parents might want. "Tradition matters, Olivia," she'd explained during one particularly tense lunch, as if speaking to someone who'd grown up without indoor plumbing. "The Hawthorne name opens doors, but it also comes with responsibilities." I'd nodded politely, knowing better than to engage. James squeezed my hand under the table, our private language of support and solidarity. That autumn, a unique opportunity arose. Oakridge Manor, my secret investment property, had been vacant for nearly a year while I considered its future. The restoration was complete, transforming it from a neglected historic home to a breathtaking estate that perfectly balanced period details with modern amenities. I'd occasionally spent weekends there alone, sleeping in different bedrooms to determine which had the best morning light, reading in the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves, or walking the grounds at dawn when mist still clung to the ancient oak trees. When James mentioned that his parents were looking for a place to host Christmas that year, their usual winter home being renovated, a wild idea took root in my mind. "I might have a solution," I said carefully over dinner one evening. "A client of mine has a property they're looking to rent out for events. It's a beautiful old estate not far from the city." James looked up from his pasta, intrigued. "Really? That could be perfect. Mom's been complaining about having to downsize the celebration because of the construction at their place." "I could arrange a viewing," I offered, my heart beating faster, at my own audacity. "The owner is very private, but I've managed several of their properties. They trust my judgment." A week later, I took James to Oakridge Manor, watching his face as we drove through the wrought iron gates and up the winding driveway lined with century-old trees. The house revealed itself gradually, first the chimneys, then the slate roof, and finally the imposing limestone facade with its perfect symmetry and elegant proportions. "This is incredible," he whispered as we stepped into the grand entrance hall with its sweeping staircase and marble floors. "Who owns this place?" "A corporate entity," I replied truthfully, if incompletely. "They prefer to remain anonymous." I showed him through the house, the formal dining room that could easily seat 30, the commercial kitchen that would delight any caterer, the various reception rooms and sitting areas where family members could gather or escape from one another as needed. "The gardens are beautiful too," I said, leading him to the terrace. "There's a heated conservatory where we could serve drinks, and the grounds are lit at night." James wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder as we looked out over the lawn. "It's perfect. Mom will be impressed, which is no small feat. Can you really arrange this?" I leaned back against him, savoring the warmth of his body and the momentary fantasy that we were just a normal couple admiring a beautiful home. "Yes, I can make it happen." I negotiated with myself, as both property owner and agent, and presented James with rental terms that were generous but not suspicious. He was delighted, especially when I mentioned that the house would come fully decorated for Christmas, complete with a 20-foot tree in the entrance hall and garlands on every staircase. What I didn't tell him was that I would be personally overseeing every detail of that decoration, or that I'd hired the best interior designer in the city to create a Christmas wonderland that would outshine anything Elizabeth Hawthorne had ever arranged. Elizabeth and William arranged to view the property themselves before committing. I met them as the agent, dressed in my most conservative suit with my hair pulled back severely. Elizabeth walked through the rooms with a critical eye, inspecting crown moldings and running her finger along mantelpieces as if checking for dust. "It has potential," she admitted reluctantly. "Who did you say owns it?" "My client prefers discretion," I replied smoothly. "But I can assure you they maintain the highest standards. The house was completely restored last year, with historically accurate methods and materials." William seemed more openly impressed, asking intelligent questions about the property's history and architectural significance. I answered each one with detailed knowledge that would have been suspicious if they'd been paying closer attention. "The price seems quite reasonable for a property of this caliber," he noted, reviewing the terms I'd provided. I smiled professionally. "My client is more interested in having the right occupants than in maximizing profit. The house has been vacant for some time, and they'd prefer to see it enjoyed, especially during the holidays." After some deliberation, they agreed to rent Oakridge Manor for the entire month of December, with the family Christmas celebration as the centerpiece. Elizabeth immediately began planning an elaborate event, inviting extended family and important business connections, nearly 100 guests in total. "We'll need to discuss the servers and catering," she informed me, already mentally arranging people like furniture. "I have very specific requirements." "Of course," I replied, knowing I would have the final say on everything that happened in my house. "I'll be happy to coordinate with your team." As December approached, I found myself in the strange position of preparing my own home for people who had no idea it belonged to me. I approved Elizabeth's requests when reasonable and gently redirected her when not, always under the guise of the owner's preferences. James noticed my increased workload but attributed it to year-end business matters. "You're working too hard," he said one night, massaging my shoulders as I reviewed contracts in bed. "After Christmas, we should take a vacation, just the two of us." I leaned into his touch, momentarily tempted to tell him everything. But something held me back. Perhaps the same instinct for self-protection that had kept me from revealing my financial status from the beginning. Once the truth was out, things would change between us for better or worse. And despite the exhaustion of maintaining the charade, I wasn't quite ready for that change. As December arrived, the Hawthornes moved into Oakridge Manor for their holiday residence. I arranged for a small staff, all people who worked for my various properties and knew me as their employer, all sworn to secrecy with generous holiday bonuses as additional motivation. James and I would join his family a week before Christmas, staying in the East Wing guest suite that I had personally designed with a private sitting room and balcony overlooking the rose garden. "Are you sure you can take that much time away from work?" James asked as we packed. "I know how busy year-end gets for you." I folded a sweater carefully, buying time to compose my response. "I've delegated what I can. Besides, your mother made it clear that our abbreviated appearance last Christmas was disappointing." I mimicked Elizabeth's precise diction, making James laugh. 2 hours was apparently insufficient time to properly judge your outfit, career, progress, and reproductive failures, I added, ticking off points on my fingers. James winced. "I'm sorry about that. You know she's just being Elizabeth," I finished for him. "I know, and I can handle Elizabeth for a week." What I didn't add was that this year, I'd be handling her on my own territory, even if she didn't know it. When we arrived at Oakridge, Elizabeth greeted us in the entrance hall like a queen receiving minor dignitaries. She wore a cashmere sweater in deep burgundy, pearls gleaming at her throat and wrists. "James, darling," she air-kissed both his cheeks. "The drive wasn't too terrible, I hope?" "It was fine, Mother," James replied, already loosening his tie. "The house looks amazing," Elizabeth practically preened. "I've made a few adjustments to the decor, of course. The owner's taste is adequate, but lacks refinement in certain areas." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from responding. The adjustments I'd already noted included moving art pieces to different walls and rearranging furniture groupings, nothing that violated our rental agreement, but irritating nonetheless. Olivia, Elizabeth nodded in my direction. Not quite, meeting my eyes. I've put you and James in the blue suite. It's quite comfortable, though not as large as we might have hoped. The blue suite was, in fact, one of the most luxurious guest accommodations in the house, with its own fireplace and recently renovated bathroom featuring a deep soaking tub and heated floors. I had specifically selected it for us. It sounds lovely, I replied. Thank you for arranging everything. Of course, she said, already turning her attention back to James. Your father is in his study on a call, but he'll want to see you before dinner. Charlotte and her husband arrive tomorrow, and your cousins the day after. As the week progressed, the house filled with Hawthornes and their various appendages, spouses, children, the occasional family friend or business associate invited for specific dinners. I watched with a mixture of amusement and irritation as they made themselves at home in my house, complaining about minor imperfections or praising features as if they'd designed them themselves. The library ceiling could be higher, William remarked to a second cousin over brandy. But the millwork is excellent. You don't see craftsmanship like this in modern homes. I smiled into my wineglass, remembering the months I'd spent finding the right artisans to restore that millwork, and the nights I'd spent in the library myself, approving stain samples and finish techniques. Each day brought new, small affronts. Elizabeth rearranged the kitchen to her liking, confusing the staff I'd hired. William commandeered the study, spreading his papers across the antique desk I'd found at an estate sale in Vermont. Charlotte's children ran through the halls unsupervised, leaving sticky fingerprints on walls and furniture. James noticed my tension and misinterpreted it. I know they can be overwhelming, he said as we dressed for yet another formal dinner. But it means a lot that you're making an effort. I fastened a simple silver necklace, one of my few concessions, to jewelry, and met his eyes in the mirror. They're your family, I said simply. He came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pressing a kiss to my neck. Yes, but you're my choice. Don't forget that. I leaned into him, savoring the moment of genuine connection amid the week's performance. There had been too few such moments lately, with both of us caught up in work and family obligations. I wondered, not for the first time, how different our relationship might have been without the shadow of his family's expectations. 2 days before Christmas, Elizabeth cornered me in the conservatory where I'd gone to escape the constant socializing. She carried a crystal glass of sherry, her posture perfect even in her so-called casual wear, tailored wool trousers and a silk blouse that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Olivia, dear, she began, the endearment at odds with her cool tone. I've been meaning to have a private word. I braced myself, setting down the book I'd been pretending to read. Of course, Elizabeth. She settled onto a wicker chair, arranging herself with practiced elegance. James tells me your business is doing well. Some sort of property management, isn't it? Business development and investment, I corrected automatically, though I knew she remembered exactly what I did. Yes, we've had a strong year. She nodded absently, looking out at the winter garden. It must be gratifying to have work. That keeps you busy. I waited, knowing this was merely the opening salvo. William and I have been discussing James's future, of course. His position at the firm is secure, but there are opportunities for advancement that would require certain commitments. From James? I asked mildly. From both of you, she clarified, her gaze sharp now. The partners' wives form an important social network. They host charity events, sit on museum boards, maintain certain standards. It's part of the package. You understand. And you don't think I fit that package, I stated. Not a question. She sighed, as if I were being deliberately obtuse. You're an intelligent woman, Olivia. Surely you must see that your background and choices are at odds with the life James was raised to lead. William and I have been patient, thinking perhaps you would adapt, but it's been 3 years. My hands tightened in my lap, but my voice remained steady. What exactly are you suggesting, Elizabeth? She took a delicate sip of her sherry. I'm suggesting that if you truly love my son, you might consider whether you're helping or hindering his potential. There are sacrifices we all make for family. The irony of her speaking about sacrifice to me, who had worked 3 jobs to pay for college while she'd never held employment in her life, was almost enough to make me break my silence then and there. Instead, I stood up slowly. Thank you. For your concern, I said carefully. But James and I make our decisions together, as partners. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. How modern. But some traditions exist for a reason, my dear. The Hawthorne name comes with responsibilities as well, as privileges. James understands this, even if he occasionally pretends otherwise. I left the conservatory with my composure intact, but inside I was seething. The conversation confirmed what I'd always suspected, that even years into my marriage, the Hawthornes still saw me as temporary, an obstacle to be overcome rather than family to be embraced. That night, I lay awake beside James, listening to his steady breathing and weighing my options. I could continue indefinitely with the charade, keeping my financial status private and enduring the Hawthornes' condescension. Or I could reveal the truth and deal with the consequences. James's potential feelings of betrayal, his family's shock and recalibration, the inevitable questions about why I'd kept it secret. Neither option felt right, but something would have to give. The weight of pretending was becoming too heavy to bear, and Elizabeth's intervention had made it clear that the pressure on our marriage would only increase. Christmas Eve arrived with a flurry of activity. The house was transformed for the evening's grand celebration. Dozens of additional poinsettias appeared. Candles were arranged on every surface. Caterers bustled in the kitchen preparing a feast for 40 immediate family members. The main event, a formal dinner and gift exchange, would be followed by an even larger reception the next day for extended family and business associates. I spent the morning helping where I could without revealing my intimate knowledge of the house, then retreated to our suite to prepare for the evening. I chose my outfit carefully, a deep emerald velvet dress, simple but elegantly cut, with my grandmother's Art Deco earrings as my only adornment. Not flashy enough to draw Elizabeth's criticism, but nice enough to avoid appearing disrespectful. James whistled when I emerged from the bathroom. "You look beautiful," he said, adjusting his tie. "Ready to face the firing squad?" I laughed despite my nerves. I've survived Hawthorne Christmases before. Barely, he reminded me, referring to the previous year when his uncle had spent 20 minutes explaining why my career was essentially glorified house flipping, while everyone at the table nodded in agreement. "This year will be different," I said, more prescient than I knew at the time. As we headed downstairs, James took my hand. "Whatever happens in there, remember, I'm on your side." I squeezed his fingers, wishing I could be certain that would still be true by the end of the night. The dining room glowed with candlelight, the long mahogany table set with the finest china, crystal, and silver. 40 Hawthornes and adjacent family members found their assigned seats, directed by Elizabeth's meticulous place cards. James and I were separated, he near his parents at the head of the table, me relegated to a spot between a distant cousin with a drinking problem and Charlotte's husband, who spent most family gatherings looking at his phone under the table. The first 3 courses progressed with the practiced rhythm of people who had been performing the same ceremony their entire lives. Conversations ebbed and flowed around investments, private school admissions, and recent renovations to various vacation properties. I participated when addressed directly but otherwise focused on my food, which was excellent despite Elizabeth's unnecessary improvements to the menu I had originally approved. It was during the main course, a perfectly prepared beef Wellington, that things began to unravel. William, flushed with wine and holiday magnanimity, raised his glass. "A toast," he announced, bringing conversations to a halt. "To family traditions and the Hawthorne legacy, carried forward another year." Glasses were raised, appreciative murmurs traveled around the table. William, encouraged, continued. "And to James," he added, "who has finally agreed to join the executive committee at the firm after the new year." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. James had mentioned nothing about this to me. Across the table, his expression confirmed my suspicion. This was not a mutual decision we had somehow forgotten to discuss. His father had blindsided him as well. "Dad," James began, his voice tight. "We haven't—" "Don't be modest, son," William interrupted smoothly. "It's been in the works for months. The paperwork is already being drawn up." Elizabeth beamed beside him, the triumphant general whose battle plan was executing perfectly. "It's time," she added, "for James to embrace his responsibilities to the family." James looked at me, apology and confusion in his eyes. I set down my fork carefully, my appetite gone. "How interesting," I said, my voice carrying in the sudden silence. "James and I must have missed some important conversations." Elizabeth's smile turned brittle. "Sometimes men need a little encouragement to do what's best for everyone. I'm sure you understand, Olivia." "What I understand," I replied evenly, "is that my husband and I make major life decisions together. At least, that's been our practice until now." William chuckled condescendingly. "These matters are quite complex, my dear. The Hawthorne Group has certain traditions and requirements that can be difficult for outsiders to grasp fully." The dismissive "my dear" ignited something in me, a slow-burning fuse that had been shortening all week. I took a sip of water, buying time as I debated how far to push this. Charlotte, never one for subtlety, jumped in. "Oh, come on, Olivia. It's not like your property work gives you special insight into multinational investment strategies. This is what James was born to do." "And what exactly do you think I was born to do, Charlotte?" I asked mildly. She blinked, thrown by the direct question. "Well, that is what my daughter means," Elizabeth interjected smoothly, "is that we all have our appropriate spheres. The Hawthorne business is naturally a family concern." "And I'm not family," I concluded for her. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. James started to speak, but his mother cut him off. "You've married into the family, of course," she said, her tone suggesting this was a technicality rather than a meaningful connection. "But there's a difference between being a Hawthorne by marriage and understanding the weight of the name, the responsibility it carries." I nodded slowly. "And you believe James should accept this position regardless of his own professional goals or our joint plans?" "James understands his obligations," William stated firmly. "He's a Hawthorne." I turned to James, whose face had become a careful mask. "Did you know about this?" He hesitated, which was answer enough. "Dad mentioned it as a possibility, but I didn't think—" "You didn't think they'd announce it as a fait accompli at Christmas dinner?" I finished for him. "Or you didn't think you needed to discuss it with me?" Elizabeth sighed dramatically. "This is precisely why these matters are usually handled within the family. Outsiders tend to make everything so emotional." Something in me snapped. 3 years of condescension, of subtle and not-so-subtle reminders of my inadequacy, of watching James struggle to balance his family's expectations with our life together. It all crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. "Tell me, Elizabeth," I said, setting down my napkin, "what exactly makes me an outsider in your eyes? Is it my background, my career, or simply that I don't blindly accept the Hawthorne way as gospel?" A hush fell over the table. This kind of direct confrontation wasn't in the Hawthorne playbook, where conflicts were handled through innuendo and passive aggression. Elizabeth's nostrils flared slightly, the only visible sign of her anger. I think your tone demonstrates my point quite effectively, Olivia. There's a certain refinement that comes from proper upbringing. Mother, James warned, but she was on a roll now. Let's be honest, Elizabeth continued, buoyed by approving. Nods from around the table. Everyone here knows this marriage was unexpected. James had always been expected to make a more suitable match, someone who understands our world. Elizabeth, William cautioned, belatedly sensing danger. She waved him off. No, it's time for frankness. Olivia, she turned to me directly. You must have known what people thought when you pursued James. A girl from your background with no family connections or significant assets, suddenly interested in one of Boston's most eligible bachelors? I felt James tense across the table. That's enough, he said sharply. It's all right, James, I said, my voice steady despite the anger coursing through me. Your mother is finally saying what she's thought since the day we met. I'd rather have honesty than 3 more years of veiled insults. Elizabeth took a deep drink of her wine. Well, if we're being honest, then yes. Many of us wondered what attracted you to James, beyond the obvious financial advantages. You think I'm a gold digger, I stated flatly, the crude term hanging in the elegant air of the dining room. I think, Elizabeth replied with cold precision, that you saw an opportunity and took it. And now you're attempting to separate James from his family and responsibilities because they don't fit your limited perspective. Silverware clattered as James stood abruptly. That's enough. You've gone too far, Mother. Apologize to Olivia immediately. Elizabeth remained perfectly composed. I'm simply saying what everyone here thinks, James. Your wife has been living quite comfortably on the Hawthorne name and connections. She's enjoyed the benefits of this lifestyle. She gestured around the opulent dining room, while contributing very little in return. Several heads nodded in agreement. Charlotte looked smug. Only James's youngest cousin, a 20-something artist who'd always been kind to me, seemed uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I could have let it go, could have excused myself gracefully and dealt with the fallout in private with James. That would have been the refined response Elizabeth might have respected, despite herself. Instead, I laughed. A genuine, spontaneous laugh that silenced the room more effectively than any angry retort. Oh, Elizabeth, I said, shaking my head. You have no idea who you're talking to, do you? She bristled. I beg your pardon? No, I don't think you do beg my pardon, I continued, standing slowly. I think you believe you're completely justified in your assessment of me. That's what makes this so fascinating. James looked confused now, but I pressed on past the point of retreat. You sit here in this beautiful house, serving dinner on this lovely china, looking down at me as if I'm beneath you, when the truth is... I paused, looking around the table, taking in the identical expressions of entitled certainty on nearly every face. The truth is what, Olivia? William challenged, his patience clearly at an end. I took a deep breath. The truth is that you're guests in my house, eating off my china, drinking my wine, and you don't even know it. The silence that followed was absolute. Elizabeth's face went blank with incomprehension, then flushed with anger. What ridiculous game are you playing? She demanded. I turned to the butler, Davis, who had worked for me for 3 years and maintained a flawlessly professional demeanor throughout this charade. Davis, would you please bring the property deed from my office? The one in the wall safe behind the... Monet. Of course, Ms. Reynolds, he replied without missing a beat. You know the combination to the safe? Charlotte asked, bewildered. I know the combination to my safe, in my office, in my house, I clarified, watching comprehension slowly dawn on their faces. That's impossible. William stated flatly. The property is owned by Meridian Holdings. We verified before signing. The rental agreement. I smiled. Meridian Holdings is my company, William. One of several I've established over the past decade. I own this estate outright, along with 12 other properties in 3 states. Elizabeth's wine glass tipped, spilling, red across the white tablecloth like blood. You're lying, she whispered. I'm not, I replied simply. I've owned Oakridge Manor for nearly 4 years. I oversaw every aspect of its restoration personally. That adequate Christmas decor you adjusted? I selected it. The antique desk you've been working at, William? I found it at an estate sale in Vermont. James stared at me, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something I couldn't quite identify. Olivia, what are you saying? Davis returned with a leather portfolio, which he handed to me with a slight bow. I withdrew the deed and several other documents, passing them to William, whose hands actually trembled as he reviewed them. I'm saying, James, that I've never needed the Hawthorne money or connections. I built my own success from nothing, the very thing your family seems to find impossible to imagine. William looked up from the papers, his face ashen. These appear to be in order, he admitted reluctantly. But why the deception? Why not tell us? I raised an eyebrow. Would it have made a difference, William? Would you have welcomed me if you'd known I was worth millions but still came from the wrong background? Or would you have found some other reason why I wasn't quite right for your son? Elizabeth's shock was hardening into fresh hostility. You deliberately misled us, made us look foolish. No, Elizabeth, I countered. You made yourselves look foolish by assuming that worth can only be measured in the ways you understand. By treating me as less than based on nothing but your own prejudice. I turned to James, whose stunned expression cut through my righteous anger. I should have told you, I said more softly. That's my only regret in this. Not the money or the properties, but keeping part of myself hidden from you. I'm sorry for that. The dining room erupted then. Charlotte demanding to know how I'd acquired my wealth, William questioning the legality of the rental agreement, various cousins whispering furiously among themselves. Elizabeth simply sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of humiliation and fury. James stood amid the chaos, looked at his family, then at me, and made a decision that would alter the course of our lives. Enough! He shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. All of you, be quiet! The table fell silent, unused to hearing James command rather than conciliate. He walked deliberately around the table to stand beside me. I don't care about the money or the house or any of it. What I care about is that my family has treated my wife with contempt from the day I brought her home. You've belittled her work, dismissed her opinions, and made her feel unwelcome, all based on assumptions that say far more about you than about her. But she lied, James, Charlotte protested. She let us believe— She protected herself, James interrupted, from exactly the kind of judgment you're displaying right now. And frankly, I don't blame her. He took my hand, his grip firm and— Sure. Olivia and I are leaving now. You're welcome to continue Christmas dinner without us. And yes, I realize the irony of you being welcome to stay in my wife's house after how you've treated her. Consider it a final act of generosity on our part. The room buzzed with objections, but James was already leading me toward the door. As we reached the threshold, Elizabeth found her voice. James Hawthorne, if you walk out that door, you're choosing her over your family. He paused, turned back to face the table of stunned Hawthornes, and nodded. Yes, Mother, that's exactly what I'm doing. Merry Christmas. And with that, we left the dining room, the heavy door swinging shut behind us on a tableau of shocked faces and shattered assumptions. The reckoning had come at last, and nothing would ever be the same again. James and I left the dining room in silence, the shocked faces of the Hawthorne family frozen behind us like a Renaissance painting of betrayal and disbelief. The grand hallway stretched before us, Christmas garlands and twinkling lights suddenly, seeming absurd against the gravity of what had just happened. "We need to talk," James said quietly, his hand still gripping mine as he led me toward the library, my favorite room in the house, though he couldn't have known that. Once inside, he closed the heavy doors and leaned against them, running a hand through his hair. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the bookshelves I had personally stocked with first editions and leather-bound classics. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away seconds that felt like hours. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. "How long have I owned this house?" "About 4 years," I replied. "How long have I been successful?" "Almost a decade." He nodded slowly, processing. "And your business? It's more than just property management, I'm guessing." "I started with small investments after business school," I explained, perching on the edge of an armchair. "Fixing up distressed properties, flipping them for profit, then commercial real estate, then development projects. Meridian Holdings is my primary company, but there are others." "Others?" he repeated. "And your net worth?" I hesitated, then decided complete honesty was the only path forward. "Just over 40 million, last valuation." James let out a low whistle, pushing away from the door to pace the room. $40 million. My wife is worth $40 million, and I had no idea. "I'm sorry, James," I said softly. "I should have told you." "Yes, you should have," he agreed, his tone sharpening. "We're married, Olivia. We're supposed to share our lives. But you've been hiding this massive part of yourself from me for years. Why?" The question hung between us, deceptively simple, yet impossible to answer without exposing vulnerabilities I'd protected my entire adult life. "At first, it was habit," I admitted. "I've always been private about my finances. When you grow up with nothing, then build something substantial, you learn to be careful who you trust with that information." "You didn't trust me?" The hurt in his voice was palpable. "It wasn't about trusting you exactly," I said, choosing my words carefully. "When we met, I liked that you didn't know. You treated me like a person, not a portfolio. And then, after I met your family—" "After you met my family, what?" James pressed when I trailed off. I stood, moving to the fireplace, needing the warmth. "After I met your family, I realized that even if they knew I had money, they'd still find reasons to consider me unsuitable. Wrong background, wrong education, wrong priorities. So what was the point?" James was quiet for a moment, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "And what about me? Was our whole relationship a test? Some kind of elaborate game to see how long you could maintain the charade?" "No." I turned to face him, alarmed by the suggestion. "James, I love you. That's never been a lie. I just compartmentalized. My business was separate from us." "Separate?" He laughed without humor. "Olivia, you literally brought me to your house and pretended it belonged to someone else. That goes beyond compartmentalizing." He had a point, and we both knew it. The absurdity of the situation struck me suddenly. Standing in my secret mansion on Christmas Eve, having just exposed my hidden wealth to my husband's family in the most dramatic way possible. If it weren't so painful, it would be almost comical. "You're right," I acknowledged. "That crossed a line. When your parents needed a place for Christmas, I saw an opportunity to, I don't know, level the playing field somehow. It was impulsive, and probably not my healthiest decision." James moved to the window, staring out at the grounds now illuminated by strategic landscape lighting, another detail I'd obsessed over during the renovation. "I feel like I don't know you," he said quietly. "The woman I married was practical, straightforward. Not someone who orchestrates elaborate reveals at Christmas dinner." His words stung, but they weren't unfair. "The woman you married has been navigating impossible expectations from your family for years," I replied. Tonight wasn't planned. James. Your mother pushed me too far and something broke loose. I'm not proud of how it happened, but I'm not sorry they finally know the truth. He turned back to me, his expression troubled. And what is the truth, Olivia? Beyond the money and the properties, who are you, really? It was the fundamental question, the one I'd been avoiding since the day we met. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I feared it would change everything between us. I'm exactly who you think I am, I said finally, just with resources you didn't know about. I still love my work. I still prefer quiet weekends to society events. I still believe in earning what you have rather than inheriting it. None of that was a lie. James crossed the room to stand before me, close enough that I could see the flecks of amber in his hazel eyes. And us? Was any of that a lie? No, I whispered, fighting back tears. Loving you has been the most honest thing I've ever done. He reached out slowly, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. I believe you, he said, but I'm still angry and confused, and trying to reconcile the woman I've been living with for 3 years with the woman who apparently owns a mansion and multiple companies. I understand, I nodded, relief mingling with apprehension. James believed me, but belief wasn't the same as forgiveness. What happens now? Now? He glanced toward the door, beyond which the Hawthorne family was presumably still in disarray. Now we need to decide what to do about Christmas, and your house full of my relatives, and my career, and basically our entire future. Despite everything, I felt a smile tugging at my lips. When you put it that way, it sounds complicated. It is complicated, James agreed, but his expression softened slightly. Though I have to admit, watching my mother realize she's been insulting the owner of the house she's been staying in. There was something deeply satisfying about that moment. A laugh escaped me, surprising us both. Her face when Davis called me Ms. Reynolds. James shook his head, a reluctant smile forming. Charlotte looked like she might actually faint. The tension between us eased fractionally, the familiar rhythm of shared humor providing a momentary respite from the heavier questions still awaiting answers. A sharp knock at the library door interrupted the fragile moment of connection. Without waiting for a response, William pushed his way in, his face tight with controlled anger. This has gone far enough, he announced, looking between us. The family is waiting for an explanation, and frankly, so am I. James straightened, his brief softness vanishing. I think Olivia made the situation quite clear, Dad. What part of "this is her house" was confusing? William's jaw tightened. The part where my son's wife has been lying to us for years. The part where she's apparently some kind of property magnate, yet presented herself as a simple businesswoman. The part where this entire Christmas has been some sort of elaborate revenge scheme. It wasn't revenge, I interjected. It was, I don't particularly care what it was, William cut me off. What I care about is fixing this embarrassing situation before it becomes common knowledge that the Hawthornes were made fools of at Christmas. I felt the familiar flash of indignation his dismissive tone always triggered. That's your concern right now? Your reputation? Of course it is, William snapped. Reputation is currency in our world, as you'd know if you truly belonged in it. Regardless of your unexpected assets. James stepped between us, his posture rigid. That's enough, Dad. You're talking to my wife, in her house. Show some respect, or leave. William looked genuinely startled, unused to direct opposition from his son. James, be reasonable. Your mother is upset, the dinner is ruined, and half the family is already calling their drivers. We need to salvage this evening. No, what we need is space, James replied firmly. Olivia and I have things to discuss privately. Please give our apologies to everyone, but we won't be rejoining dinner tonight. William's face flushed. You can't just... Yes, we can. James interrupted. And we are. Good night, Dad. For a moment, William looked as though he might argue further, but something in James's expression stopped him. He straightened his jacket, with a sharp tug, nodded stiffly, and left the library without another word. As the door closed behind him, James turned back to me with a weariness that made him look suddenly older. So, he said quietly, where were we? Deciding our future, I reminded him, equally exhausted but determined to see this through. Starting with tonight. James nodded, moving to pour 2 glasses of brandy from the crystal decanter on the sidebar, another of my carefully chosen pieces. He handed me one and raised his in a small toast. To honesty, he said. However belated. I clinked my glass against his. To honesty, and to whatever comes next. We drank in silence, the fire crackling behind us as we contemplated the ruins of Christmas present and the uncertain shape of Christmas future. The grandfather clock in the library chimed midnight, marking the official start of Christmas Day. James and I had been talking for hours, emptying our respective reservoirs of truth after years of partial disclosures and careful omissions. So, the apartment in the city? James asked, loosening his tie as he settled deeper into the leather armchair opposite mine. I own the building, I admitted. I bought it as an investment 5 years ago before we met. When we were looking for a place together, it seemed convenient. He shook his head, a mix of disbelief and reluctant admiration crossing his features. And I insisted on paying half the rent. You did, I confirmed. I put it in a separate account. I was going to tell you eventually, maybe use it for something we both wanted. A slush fund of my own money, James laughed softly. I don't even know what that is. We'd moved past the initial shock and anger into something more nuanced. A careful rebuilding of understanding between 2 people who realized they didn't know each other quite as well as they'd thought. What about the executive committee position? I asked, the question that had triggered the whole evening's revelation. Were you really considering it without discussing it with me? James sighed, rubbing his temples. Dad mentioned it months ago, but I told him I wasn't interested. I thought that was the end of it. Then last week he called saying they were finalizing the appointments and needed my answer. I told him again I needed time, that we needed to talk about it. But he announced it anyway, I finished for him. Classic William Hawthorne move. James nodded. Create a situation where backing out would cause maximum embarrassment, then act surprised when you're upset about being manipulated. We were quiet for a moment, the fire dying to embers in the hearth. I don't want the position, James said finally. I never have. I became a lawyer to help people, not to manage family wealth. Would you have told me that before tonight? I asked, genuinely curious. Or would you have taken it to keep the peace? He considered the question seriously. I'd like to think I would have refused regardless. But honestly, the pressure was intense. You've seen how they operate. I have, I acknowledged. Which is why I understand keeping secrets to protect yourself from them. That's part of why I never told you about my financial situation. I saw how they treated you, the constant expectations, the emotional manipulation, and I didn't want to become another piece they could use against you. James leaned forward, his expression earnest. But don't you see? By keeping it from me too, you didn't give me the chance to choose differently. You decided for both of us. His words landed with the weight of truth. In my effort to avoid becoming a pawn in the Hawthorne family game, I'd effectively created my own game with different rules. You're right, I said softly. I thought I was protecting our relationship, but I was controlling it in my own way. We both were, James admitted. Me by not standing up to my family sooner, you by withholding this part of your life. The realization settled between us that our individual attempts to shield each other had instead created a barrier of half-truths that neither of us had fully recognized until tonight. So, where do we go from here? I asked, voicing the question that had hovered unspoken through hours of conversation. James stood, stretching his tall frame before moving to kneel beside my chair. He took my hands in his expression more open and unguarded than I'd seen in months. First, we finish being honest with each other, he said. No more secrets, no more separate lives. I want to know everything about your business, and I want you to know everything about my struggles with my family. Not because either of us has a right to demand it, but because sharing those things might actually make them easier to carry. Tears pricked at my eyes. I'd like that. Second, he continued, we decide together what kind of life we want. Not what my parents expect or what your business allows, what we want. If that's continuing to live in the city, great. If it's moving into this ridiculously beautiful house you've been hiding, also great. If it's selling everything and opening a taco stand in Mexico, that works too. I laughed, the tension finally breaking. I'm pretty good at property development, but I make terrible tacos. I've noticed, he grinned. That attempt on Cinco de Mayo was genuinely concerning. We smiled at each other, the familiar rhythm of our relationship reasserting itself beneath the night's revelations. And third, I prompted. James's expression grew serious again. Third, we figure out what to do about my family. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon. Because what happened at dinner can't be undone, and we need to decide what kind of relationship we want with them going forward, if any. The weight of that decision hung between us. For all their flaws, the Hawthornes were James's family, the people who had shaped him long before I entered his life. I don't want to be the reason you lose your family, I said carefully. Despite everything, I know they matter to you. They do, he acknowledged. But you're my family too, Olivia. My choice. And if they can't respect that, can't respect you, then maybe some distance is what we need. A soft knock interrupted us. Davis appeared at the door, his professional demeanor unchanged despite the evening's dramatics. Pardon the intrusion, he said. But I thought you might want to know that most of the family has departed. Mrs. Hawthorne Sr. and Mr. Hawthorne are retiring to their suite and have indicated they will be checking out in the morning. Thank you, Davis, I replied, unsurprised. And the others? Miss Charlotte and her husband have also decided to leave early. The cousins from the West Wing are undecided but leaning toward departure. Only Mr. Alexander Hawthorne has explicitly asked to stay through the holiday as planned. Alexander was James's youngest cousin, the artistic one who had always been kind to me. His decision to stay felt like a small victory. Please ensure everyone has what they need for the night, I said. And Davis, thank you for your discretion throughout all of this. He inclined his head slightly. Of course, Ms. Reynolds. Will you be requiring anything else this evening? James and I exchanged glances. I think we're good for now, James answered. For us both. As Davis withdrew, closing the door silently behind him, James shook his head in wonder. You have staff, who know you, and call you Ms. Reynolds. Just a few key people, I clarified. Davis manages the property when I'm not using it. There's also Mrs. Chen who oversees the maintenance and Giorgio who tends the gardens. Giorgio, James repeated. The Italian man who was trimming hedges when we arrived? The one my mother complained wasn't doing it properly? The very same, I confirmed. He's a landscape architect with a master's from Cornell who's worked on some of the finest estates in New England. Your mother's critique did not impress him. James laughed again, the sound warming me more than the fire ever could. This is going to take some getting used to. For both of us, I agreed. I've never shared this part of my life with anyone before. He stood, pulling me to my feet and into his arms. Then we'll figure it out together, starting tomorrow. It is tomorrow, I pointed out, nodding toward the clock. Merry Christmas, James. Merry Christmas, Olivia. he murmured, pulling me closer. Thank you for the most unforgettable gift I've ever received. The whole truth. I leaned my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Even if it came in somewhat dramatic packaging? Especially because it came in dramatic packaging, he chuckled. I'll be dining out on the story of my mother's face for decades. We stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms in the quiet library, the house settling around us like a living thing. The night had brought pain and difficult truths, but also a new foundation, one built on complete honesty rather than careful accommodations and polite fictions. Come on, James said finally, taking my hand. Let's go upstairs, to our room, in your house. Our house, I corrected him, if you want it to be. He smiled, the genuine smile I'd fallen in love with years ago. Let's call it a possibility. One of many we'll explore together. As we climbed the grand staircase, fingers intertwined, I felt lighter than I had in years. The carefully constructed walls between different parts of my life had crumbled, and while the debris would take time to clear, what remained was space to build something new, something real and whole and shared. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, difficult conversations with departing Hawthornes, decisions about our future, the practical considerations of merging our previously compartmentalized lives. But tonight, as Christmas Day began in the quiet hours of early morning, it was enough to simply be together in truth, finally seeing and being seen without reservation. The blue suite that had been ours for the week now held new meaning as we closed the door behind us. No more pretending, no more separate lives. Just James and Olivia, starting again with eyes wide open. You know, James said as we prepared for bed, most people just exchange sweaters or books for Christmas. You revealed a secret fortune and a mansion. Go big or go home, I quipped, then realized the accidental pun. Which in this case was the same thing. He groaned at the joke but pulled me close again, his expression growing serious. Promise me something. Anything, I said, meaning it completely for perhaps the first time. No more secrets, not about money or houses or family or anything that matters, even when it's hard, even when you think you're protecting me. I want all of you, Olivia. The successful businesswoman, the secret millionaire, the woman who still clips coupons out of habit, all of it. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. I promise. No more compartments, no more separate lives. Good, he said, sealing the promise with a kiss. Because it turns out I married a fascinating woman I'm only just beginning to know, and I don't want to miss a thing. As we drifted toward sleep, Christmas morning unfolding outside our windows, I realized that the best gift of the holiday wasn't the vindication I'd felt at the dinner table or even James's steadfast support afterward. It was the freedom of finally being whole, of no longer dividing myself into the pieces others could accept and the pieces I kept hidden away. For the first time since I'd started building my business empire, success felt complete. Not because of the properties or the millions, but because I could finally share it with the person who mattered most. Christmas morning arrived with uncomfortable clarity. James and I stood on our balcony, surveying the snow-covered grounds of Oakridge Manor, my property that was now fully known to be mine. They're all leaving after breakfast, James said. My parents included. I nodded, unsurprised. What do you want to do? Talk to them before they go. Not to apologize, but to establish where we stand going forward. We dressed simply, a deliberate choice that felt like its own small declaration of independence from Hawthorne expectations. When we entered the breakfast room, only Alexander remained, scrolling through his phone. The guests of honor? He smiled, standing to embrace us both. That was quite a show last night. Aunt Elizabeth may never recover. My parents? James asked. Garden room, having a private breakfast and probably plotting their exit strategy. We found William and Elizabeth by the windows, barely touching their food. They looked up as we entered, faces carefully composed. James. Olivia. William nodded stiffly. We were just discussing our departure. I've called for a car. Before you go, James said, we wanted to talk. Elizabeth gestured to the empty chairs. I suppose we should clear the air. We sat opposite them, like adversaries at a negotiation table, which in many ways we were. I never intended last night to unfold as it did, I began. It wasn't a trap or a scheme to embarrass you. Yet here we are, thoroughly embarrassed, Elizabeth replied coldly. 3 years you've allowed us to believe you were someone else entirely. I've always been exactly who I am, I countered. You simply made assumptions based on where I came from rather than who I am now. James leaned forward, his expression firm. Let's be clear. Olivia didn't owe you her financial statement. And while I wish she had told me sooner, I understand why she didn't. Our marriage isn't the issue here, he continued when Elizabeth tried to interject. What happened last night was the culmination of years of subtle and not-so-subtle indications that Olivia wasn't good enough for the Hawthorne name. The garden room fell silent. Outside, a groundskeeper cleared snow from the paths, his movements methodical against the tension inside. What are you saying, James? William finally asked, his voice unusually subdued. Moving forward, things will be different. Olivia and I are a unit. My loyalty is to her. If you want a relationship with me, it comes with respect for my wife. Not tolerance, not polite distance, but genuine respect. Elizabeth's face paled. You're choosing her over your family? I'm choosing the family I've created with her, James corrected gently. And I'm asking my parents to respect that choice. And the firm? William asked. The executive committee position? I won't be taking it, James said firmly. I'm happy with my current practice. That's not open for negotiation. William nodded slowly, seeming less surprised than I expected. Perhaps he had always known James's heart wasn't in the family business. You've made yourself quite clear, Elizabeth said, her voice carefully controlled. Though I hardly recognize you this morning. I think you're seeing me clearly for the first time in years, James replied. Not as the son you tried to shape, but as the man I've actually become. Elizabeth flinched slightly, then looked at me directly. You love him, she said. Not a question, but a realization. With everything I am, I replied honestly. Money or no money, mansion or no mansion. She nodded once, a crisp acknowledgement rather than agreement. Well, it seems we have much to reconsider. William stood abruptly. We'll do that reconsideration at home. Our car should be arriving shortly. James rose as well, reaching for my hand. Take the time you need. When you're ready to talk, really talk, without judgment or agenda, we'll be here. Here? Elizabeth's gaze swept the room. You'll be staying at Oakridge? We haven't decided, I replied. But wherever we are, the door will be open when you're ready to walk through it differently than you have before. William extended his hand to James, a formal gesture that couldn't hide the emotion behind it. Merry Christmas, son. We'll be in touch. James hugged them both briefly, surprising them. Elizabeth remained stiff, but her hand lingered on his arm a moment longer than necessary. She nodded to me, not quite ready for more, and then they withdrew to prepare for departure. We watched from the windows as they emerged on the driveway 20 minutes later, neither looking back before sliding into their car and disappearing beyond the gates. Do you think they'll come around? I asked softly. James considered this thoughtfully. Eventually, yes. They love me, in their way, and they're nothing if not practical. Once the shock wears off, they'll calculate the benefits of reconciliation against the costs of estrangement. The remaining Hawthornes departed throughout the day, some with stilted goodbyes, others simply vanishing. By evening, only Alexander remained, sprawled comfortably in the library with a book and a glass of scotch. So, he said as we joined him. What now for the secret millionaire and her liberated husband? World domination? A tell-all memoir? James laughed, settling beside me on the sofa. I think we've generated enough scandal for one holiday season. That night, after Alexander retired to his room, James and I walked the grounds wrapped in heavy coats, our breath forming clouds in the hard, cold air. The landscape lighting illuminated the paths, casting the formal gardens in a soft, magical glow. I can see why you fell in love with this place, James said as we paused by the frozen pond. It has a soul to it. It does, I agreed. The first time I walked through, it was a mess, leaking roof, peeling wallpaper. But I could feel what it could be again with the right care. James squeezed my hand. That's how I knew I loved you. You see the potential in things others have given up? On, including yourself? I asked gently. He nodded thoughtfully. I was going through the motions before I met you, following the path laid out for me, never finding the courage to veer off course. You helped me remember I had choices. And now you've made a big one, I observed. Standing up to your parents like that. It was a watershed moment. It was past. Time, he replied firmly. And oddly, I think they might respect me more for it eventually. Hawthornes value strength, even when it's directed against them. We continued walking, the manor's windows glowing with welcoming light ahead. No longer a stage set for a performance, but simply our sanctuary for the night. We should host our own Christmas dinner tomorrow, James suggested suddenly. Just us and Alex, maybe your team if they're available, remake the holiday into something genuine. I'd love that, I said, touched by what his suggestion represented. And maybe make it a new tradition? Christmas at Oakridge, but on our terms? Our terms, James repeated thoughtfully. I think that's going to be our theme going forward, isn't it? Life on our terms, not my family's, not society's, not anyone's but ours. The week between Christmas and New Year's unfolded like the opening chapters of a new book. With the weight of secrecy lifted, I felt lighter and more grounded than I had in years. Each day brought a fresh opportunity to merge the previously separate parts of my life, starting with introducing James to my business world. The day after Christmas, I took him to my main office downtown, a converted industrial space I'd purchased and renovated 5 years earlier. The brick exterior was understated, but inside, the open-concept workspace hummed with energy even during the holiday lull. Team members looked up with undisguised curiosity as we entered. So this is where you disappear to, James mused, taking in the exposed beams and glass-walled meeting rooms. It's not what I expected. What did you expect? I asked. Something more corporate, I guess. This feels creative, collaborative. That's exactly what I wanted, I smiled. Real estate development isn't just about numbers, it's about vision. Miranda, my executive assistant, approached with a knowing smile. Tall, efficient, and fiercely loyal, she'd been my right hand through countless projects. Mr. Hawthorne, she greeted James, extending her hand. So nice to finally meet you. And may I say, about time. James laughed. I hear there was a betting pool about when I'd find out about all this. There was, Miranda confirmed without embarrassment. And for the record, I lost. I had you figuring it out months ago during the Westlake project. You didn't account for my exceptional compartmentalization skills, I pointed out. As Miranda gave James a tour, I observed my husband's reactions carefully. There was wonder and genuine interest, but no resentment or jealousy. He asked thoughtful questions about development timelines and restoration philosophies, engaging with this newly revealed facet of my life with characteristic intelligence. Throughout the day, more team members appeared. Edward from finance, Zara from acquisitions, Marcus from legal, each greeting James with a mixture of curiosity and warmth. The refrain was consistent. We've heard so much about you, and it's about time we met. They all seem to like you, James observed later as we walked through one of my commercial properties. But they're also oddly protective. They've been part of my journey for years, I explained. They know how hard I worked to build this, and how careful I've been about keeping it separate. But why? James asked. Did you think I'd be threatened by your success? We paused in the building's lobby, a soaring space with exposed brick and a living wall of greenery. Not threatened exactly, I said carefully. But I'd seen how men reacted to successful women before. Previous relationships changed once they realized I wasn't just doing well, I was doing exceptionally well. Suddenly they felt the need to compete, to prove themselves. James considered this. And you thought I'd be the same? I hoped you wouldn't, I admitted. But the longer I waited to tell you, the harder it became. The secret itself became the problem rather than what I was keeping secret. He nodded slowly. I understand that better than you might think. The longer I avoided confronting my parents about their treatment of you, the more impossible it seemed to address it. We continued our tour, moving through properties across the city. The boutique hotel converted from an old fire station, the mixed-use development that had revitalized a struggling neighborhood, the historic theater I'd saved from demolition. With each stop, I shared not just the business details but the stories behind them, the challenges and victories that had shaped my professional identity. By sunset, as we stood on the rooftop garden of my newest development watching the city, lights come alive below us, something had shifted between us, a deeper understanding that went beyond the revelation of my financial status. I see you more clearly now, James said softly. Not just as my wife or the woman navigating my complicated family, but as a force in your own right. A creator. A visionary. His simple recognition brought unexpected tears to my eyes. That's all I ever wanted, to be seen for who I really am, not who others expect me to be. Over the next few days, we continued exploring this new territory of complete honesty. James shared his frustrations with his career path and his dreams of environmental law that had been sidelined by family expectations. I revealed the full scope of my business empire, not just the properties but the strategic vision that connected them. We began discussing what came next. Where would we live primarily? The city apartment or Oakridge manor? How involved did James want to be in my business operations? What boundaries should we establish with the Hawthorne family going forward? I've been thinking, James said one evening as we sat by the fire in the manor's library. I might leave the firm, start my own practice focused on environmental cases. I studied his face, seeing the certainty there. You've wanted that for a while, haven't you? He nodded. But it never seemed possible. Too risky. Too disappointing to my father. Now it feels like the only way forward. What changed? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Everything, he said simply. Watching you stand in your truth made me realize how much of my life I've lived according to someone else's script. I don't want to do that anymore. I reached for his hand, feeling the pieces of our new life clicking into place. Then don't. On New Year's Eve, we hosted a small gathering at Oakridge, Alexander, Miranda, and her husband, a few close friends, who had always known both sides of me. As midnight approached, James pulled me onto the terrace, champagne glasses in hand. To new beginnings, he proposed as fireworks began erupting over the distant city skyline. And to complete truths, I added, clinking my glass against his. His kiss tasted of champagne and possibility, the first page of a story we would write together, with no secrets and no separate worlds to maintain. The mansion that had once been my private refuge had become something more significant, the foundation of a shared future built on authenticity rather than accommodation. The gold digger accusation that had seemed so devastating on Christmas Eve now felt almost like a gift, the catalyst that had forced us both to confront the careful fictions we'd maintained. As we rejoined our friends to count down the final seconds of the year, I realized that what had begun as a crisis had transformed into liberation. The truth, it seemed, had set us both free. 6 months after that fateful Christmas dinner, James and I hosted our first formal gathering at Oakridge Manor. The occasion was the launch of my newest venture, a foundation providing affordable housing and business spaces for low-income entrepreneurs. Among the guests mingling in the gardens, on that perfect June evening, were William and Elizabeth Hawthorne. The path to their presence had been neither straight nor easy. After their abrupt departure on Christmas Day, weeks of silence followed. The first tentative communication came in February, a stiff email from William inquiring about tax documents for James, with a brief postscript acknowledging recent events and suggesting perhaps a conversation would be beneficial when emotions have cooled. March brought a carefully neutral lunch between James and his father. April saw a tense but civil coffee meeting where I joined them, Elizabeth noticeably absent. By May, we had progressed to dinner at a neutral restaurant, all 4 of us present, and making stilted conversation about safe topics. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't war either. A fragile truce built on the shared recognition that while the old dynamics could never return, perhaps something new could gradually take their place. When we extended the invitation to the foundation launch, I honestly wasn't sure they would accept. The event would be held at Oakridge, the site of their humiliation, and would feature my business associates, a world they had previously dismissed. But the RSVP came back promptly, William's precise handwriting confirming their attendance. "They're making an effort," James observed as we watched the Hawthornes' car pull into the circular drive. "That's more than I expected." We descended the stone steps as William emerged first, distinguished in a summer weight suit, then extended his hand to help Elizabeth from the passenger side. She wore cream linen with a single strand of pearls, her posture perfect, but her expression less certain than I remembered. "Olivia." William nodded, extending his hand. "Congratulations on your foundation. It's an impressive initiative." "Thank you," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "We're hoping to make a real difference for families like the one I grew up in." Elizabeth cleared her throat delicately. "The invitation mentioned a focus on entrepreneurship education as well?" I blinked, surprised by her interest. "Yes, that's right. Small business skills, microloans, mentorship programs." "A worthy focus," she said, her tone neutral but not dismissive. "Perhaps. I have some experience with educational charity boards that might be relevant, if you're interested in discussing it." James's eyebrows rose slightly at this unexpected overture. "I'd welcome that conversation, Elizabeth," I said sincerely. "There's still much to develop in the educational programming." As the evening progressed, I watched the Hawthornes navigate this unfamiliar social territory. William engaged in lengthy conversation with my chief financial officer, finding common ground in investment strategies. Elizabeth, to my continuing surprise, spent time with the young women from our entrepreneurship cohort, listening with apparent interest to their business plans. At one point, standing beside the koi pond, Elizabeth said quietly, "You've done remarkable work here, Olivia. The house has character again. Life." The simple compliment caught me off guard. "Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you." Her gaze met mine directly. "I have not been fair to you," she said, the words clearly difficult. "My expectations for James's life, for who he should marry, what his path should be, blinded me to the reality of who he actually is, who you both are together." It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but for a woman of her generation and background, this acknowledgement represented a seismic shift. "We may never be close," Elizabeth continued, her composure slipping just enough to reveal vulnerability, "but I do not wish to lose my son. And that means finding a way to accept the life he has chosen, with you." "I would like that," I said carefully. "Not for my sake, but for James. He needs his family, even as he builds his own life separate from their expectations. She nodded once, a gesture somehow both regal and humble. Then we shall try. A new beginning, perhaps. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, William and Elizabeth approached us with a small gift bag Elizabeth had retrieved from their car. A housewarming gift, she explained. Belatedly, of course. Inside was a silver frame holding a black and white photograph of Oakridge Manor from the 1920s, the house in its original glory. It's from the Historical Society archives, William explained. We thought you might appreciate having a piece of the house's history. The thoughtfulness of the gift, so specifically chosen for me rather than a generic expensive item, rendered me momentarily speechless. Thank you. It's perfect. The house has had many lives, Elizabeth said, her gaze sweeping over the facade. Many owners who left their mark. Now it has you, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Someone who sees its value beyond its pedigree. The words held meaning beyond the simple observation about the property, and we all recognized it. James slipped his hand into mine, a silent acknowledgement of the moment's significance. As we said our goodbyes, there were no dramatic declarations or emotional embraces, but William's handshake lingered a beat longer than necessary, and Elizabeth's nod held a new measure of respect. Progress, James murmured as we watched their car disappear down the drive. Real progress. The snow fell gently outside the windows of Oakridge Manor as we prepared for our second Christmas in residence. Unlike last year's professionally decorated perfection, this year's celebration reflected our true selves. Ornaments collected from travels mingling with antique glass balls and homemade decorations from children in our foundation program. Years since the Christmas revelation had transformed all our lives. James had left his law firm to establish his own practice focused on environmental advocacy. My business had expanded into higher-profile projects, and I'd started speaking at conferences about sustainable development. Even the Hawthornes had evolved, William directing serious investors my way, Elizabeth surprisingly involved with our entrepreneurship program for young women. 1 year ago tonight, James mused as we stood in the entrance hall, my mother called you a gold digger, and our lives changed forever. For the better, I'd say, I replied, adjusting a handmade ornament on the tree. Without question, he agreed, pulling me into his arms. Though I'd still like to think we would have found our way here eventually. Perhaps, I acknowledged, but sometimes we need a push to become our authentic selves. The doorbell chimed, announcing the first guests of our Christmas Eve gathering, a blend of family, friends, colleagues, and community partners. Alexander arrived with armfuls of gifts, followed by Miranda and her husband, then several of my team members, and finally the Hawthornes, precisely on time. Dinner was served in the same formal dining room where last year's confrontation had unfolded, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. Conversations flowed without the strangling constraints of proper Hawthorne etiquette. Even Elizabeth contributed to the lively discussion, offering an occasional smile that would have been unthinkable a year ago. After dessert, I unveiled the surprise I'd been planning for months, architectural renderings for the Hawthorne Reynolds Center for Community Innovation, an addition to Oakridge Manor that would provide space for entrepreneurs and community groups. It's perfect, James said, his voice thick with emotion as he studied the plans showing how his legal expertise and my development skills had created something neither of us could have achieved alone. As guests departed and midnight approached, James and I stood in our bedroom, snow still falling gently outside the windows. Happy? He asked, echoing the question he'd posed after the foundation launch. Happier than I ever thought possible, I replied honestly. A year ago today, I was preparing for another Christmas of careful omissions and strategic invisibility. Now here we are, whole, authentic, building something meaningful together. James raised his glass in a private toast. To uncomfortable truths, he said, and the freedom they bring. I clinked my glass against his. And to mansions, I added with a smile, and the unexpected journeys they contain. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering last year's footprints, and preparing the ground for whatever new paths we might forge in the year to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.